The autumn rain hammered against the windows of the chateau that served as headquarters for Army Group G, located in the Alsatian town of Molsheim. It was late September 1944, and the maps spread across the conference table told a story of systematic disaster. Field Marshal Johannes Blaskowitz stood before those maps with the bearing of a professional soldier who had served through 2 wars, his weathered face showing the strain of commanding forces that were being systematically destroyed despite every tactical principle he had learned in 4 decades of military service. Around the table sat the corps and division commanders who had been summoned to discuss the crisis consuming their forces. General Hasso von Manteuffel, commander of 5th Panzer Army, studied the situation maps with the intensity of a man searching for solutions that did not exist. General Otto von Knobelsdorff, whose First Army had borne the brunt of recent American offensives, sat with his arms crossed, his expression grim. Generalleutnant Edgar Feuchtinger, commander of the 21st Panzer Division, looked exhausted, his uniform showing the mud and wear of continuous operations without respite. The situation they faced defied conventional military logic. For weeks they had been implementing textbook defensive operations against the American Third Army. They had established strongpoints, created defensive depth, positioned reserves for counterattacks, and fortified natural obstacles. Every principle of defensive warfare that had been taught at the Kriegsakademie, every lesson learned from the Eastern Front about conducting fighting withdrawals and establishing new defensive lines, had been applied with professional competence. And yet they were losing steadily and catastrophically to an enemy who seemed to treat defensive positions as minor inconveniences rather than serious obstacles. Blaskowitz began the conference by reviewing the current situation with the methodical precision that characterized his command style. The Third Army, under the command of General George S. Patton, had broken through German lines in multiple sectors. American armored divisions were operating deep in areas that should have been secure rear zones. Supply lines were cut, communication networks disrupted. Headquarters were overrun before they could relocate. Entire divisions reported that they were bypassed, isolated, unable to establish contact with adjacent units. The field marshal's finger traced American penetrations on the map, and the pattern that emerged was both clear and inexplicable. Patton's forces were not reducing German strongpoints, they were going around them. They were not fighting for control of road junctions and bridges. They were finding alternate routes or repairing destroyed infrastructure faster than the Germans could destroy it. They were not pausing to consolidate gains after penetrations. They were accelerating, pushing deeper before German reserves could be positioned to seal the breach. Von Manteuffel spoke up, his voice carrying the frustration of a panzer commander accustomed to offensive operations, now forced into reactive defense. He described how his division had established what should have been an impenetrable defensive position along a river line. Fields of fire had been cleared. Artillery was pre-registered on likely avenues of approach. Infantry dug in with interlocking fields of fire. The position had been prepared according to doctrine, utilizing terrain advantages and creating defense in depth. Engineers had demolished bridges, mined likely ford sites, and prepared demolitions on key structures. Anti-tank guns were positioned to cover the most likely crossing points. Machine gun nests were established with overlapping fields of fire. Mortar teams had registered their weapons on the far bank. Observation posts were placed in church steeples and other elevated positions. By every measure of defensive preparation, the position was formidable. American forces had probed the position, encountered resistance, and within hours shifted their axis of advance. Instead of battering against the prepared defenses, Patton's forces moved laterally, found a weakly held sector 15 kilometers to the south, penetrated there with overwhelming force, and then drove into the rear of the riverline position. Von Manteuffel's carefully prepared defenses had been rendered irrelevant without ever being seriously tested. His forces were forced to abandon their positions and retreat to avoid encirclement, and in the retreat they lost cohesion, equipment, and men. What made the experience particularly galling, von Manteuff continued, was the speed of the American response. German doctrine held that shifting an axis of advance required time to reconnoiter new routes, time to regroup forces, time to coordinate supporting fires. But American reconnaissance had apparently already identified the weak sector. American forces reoriented within hours rather than days, and American artillery and air support shifted seamlessly to support the new axis of advance. It was as if Patton's entire force was designed for rapid reorientation in ways that German forces, for all their experience, could not match. Knobelsdorff added his own experiences to this grim catalog. His First Army had attempted to establish a series of defensive lines, each positioned to delay the American advance while preparations were made for the next line to the rear. This was standard doctrine for a fighting withdrawal: trade space for time, inflict casualties on the attacker, preserve your own force for the next defensive position. But Patton's forces were moving faster than the German timetable allowed. Defensive positions that were supposed to hold for 3 or 4 days were being penetrated or bypassed in less than 24 hours. The problem, Knobelsdorff explained, was that Patton did not seem to care about reducing every defensive position. Traditional offensive doctrine called for systematic reduction of enemy strongpoints to secure flanks and rear areas. But the American general was willing to leave German garrisons isolated in his rear, trusting that follow-on forces or air power would deal with them eventually. This freed his armored spearheads to maintain momentum, to keep moving faster than the German command could react. Feuchtinger described the experience from a division commander's perspective. His 21st Panzer Division had been moved repeatedly to plug gaps in the line, rushed from one crisis to another, never given time to properly prepare positions or coordinate with adjacent units. They would arrive at a sector, begin deploying, and before the deployment was complete, American forces would already be pushing through somewhere else. The division was being worn down, not through pitched battles, but through constant movement, through fighting meeting engagements while strung out on the march, through losing vehicles to mechanical breakdown because there was no time for proper maintenance. What made it worse, Feuchtinger continued, was that the Americans seemed to know exactly where the gaps were, exactly where German defenses were weakest.
Their reconnaissance was superb, supported by total air superiority that allowed observation aircraft to range freely over German positions. By the time a defensive position was established, American commanders already knew its strength and disposition and were planning how to bypass or overwhelm it. Blaskowitz listened to these accounts with growing concern. What his subordinates were describing was not simply a tactical problem, but a fundamental mismatch in operational tempo. The German defensive system was designed around a decision cycle that assumed certain time intervals: time to identify an enemy thrust, time to reposition reserves, time to establish new defensive lines, time to coordinate counterattacks. But Patton was operating inside that decision cycle. He was moving faster than the German system could process and respond to threats. Blaskowitz finally summarized the brutal conclusion that everyone in the room already understood but had hesitated to say openly. Traditional defensive operations were not working against the Third Army. They could implement perfect defensive tactics and still lose because Patton was fighting a different kind of battle, one where position mattered less than momentum, where static defense was a liability rather than an advantage, where speed decided the outcome. The field marshal began outlining what he called a fighting withdrawal strategy. Instead of trying to hold lines, forces would be positioned to impose maximum delay with minimum commitment. Strong points would exist not to be held indefinitely, but to force Americans to deploy and lose time. Counterattacks would be small-scale and immediate, designed to disrupt American operations rather than recapture ground. The goal would be to trade space for time and preserve combat power. But even as Blaskowitz outlined the strategy, he understood its limitations. It was an admission that they could not defeat Patton, only delay him. It was a strategy of managed retreat. As darkness fell over the Alsatian countryside, American armored columns continued to move west of their positions, maintaining the relentless operational tempo that had broken German defenses from Normandy to eastern France. Blaskowitz later sat alone in the dim conference room studying the maps. Germany had invented blitzkrieg. Now it was being used against Germany at a pace even faster than the Wehrmacht had once achieved. Patton was conducting blitzkrieg on a scale and speed that German forces could no longer match. And that realization marked the moment when the campaign in the West was irretrievably lost. Not because the German army had forgotten how to fight, but because the enemy had learned how to fight faster.